and we want to talk about social protection in Kenya. Now, my guest in studio is Levi Gikandi, and he's a media advisor with and consultant with Oxfam Kenya. Karibu sana to
Asante
the
sana.
show. All right. So, of course, as we know, COVID-19 has caused unprecedented shocks to households, food and nutrition, and general food and nutrition security. And a lot has actually changed in these last 7 months. And I think part of the question that many of us are grappling with is, has the support actually been enough, and is it reaching the most vulnerable populations in our country? What is government's role in all of this? What is the NGO's role in all of this? What do we as citizens have a role in this as well? And this then brings up the question of safety nets, which in an economy of ours is something that should have been established well before COVID. And I know there are a few, but I guess the first question is, have they proven themselves resilient in the face of COVID?
Yes, I think they have. And if I could just begin by discussing sort of the broad idea of social protection, if that's okay. So when you have a family member who's sick and they can't afford their medical bills, if you can afford to, you tend to step in to take care of them. That's, in essence, what social protection is on a national level. Oxfam believes that social protection is a set of reliable institutions and services that step in when people are facing risk, when vulnerable families, like you mentioned in the COVID-19 crisis, have lost income, and protects them both from widespread crises like the COVID-19 crises, or even household level crises like a death of a family member who was the main income earner, and all of a sudden you can't put food on the table. It's part of the Kenyan constitution to have social protection. It's part of our most fundamental religious beliefs. And what we're seeing on a national level are attempts to realize this, led by the government. The government has a program called Inua Jamii, which has spent, I believe, 13 billion shillings on social protection since the beginning of 2020.
Yeah.
And we're part of a consortium of NGOs and civil sector actors that are trying to expand this effect and make sure that the people who haven't been covered already are covered, and that other vulnerable categories like survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, women-headed households, pregnant women, lactating women are also protected in this time.
Yeah. Okay, great. And I'm so glad you've mentioned Inua Jamii. I actually used to work for FSD Kenya.
Oh, awesome.
And Milka Chebi, who of course was running that program, shout out to you for the great work. And okay, so we've now understood part of what social protection actually does entail. I think in the context of COVID-19, because social protection, of course, is in our constitution, but in the context of COVID-19, this has kind of uprooted or elevated the challenge far beyond what was originally envisaged.
Absolutely.
How are things actually being handled right now? Because whatever was set aside was prior to the COVID challenges. So
Absolutely.
Clearly there's a need for supplementation of some sort there.
Absolutely. So the COVID-19 crisis has made things even more difficult for people who are already suffering, as you know. COVID-19 has infected and affected diplomats, government officials, celebrities, but we find that it's affecting poor people the most, especially people in informal settlements. In Nairobi, for example, 56% of the population, an estimated 56%, lives on just 6% of the land. That's Kibera, Korogocho, all the informal settlements that we know. These are generally overcrowded spaces where water sometimes is more expensive than even in affluent areas like Lavington. So these are ideal transmission conditions for COVID-19. And on top of that, you find that the people who live here, the people who work here, who by the way are the majority of Kenyans, have lost their jobs. These are the mamambogas who lost their clients during COVID-19. These are the domestic workers who were sent home because people were afraid. These are all of the people who are almost family in our households, but who have lost their source of income. So the government's Inua Jamii program has been supporting a lot of these people with grants, and we, as a consortium of other civil sector actors, have identified that there is still more to be done.
Yeah.
We find that as part of our consortium, which is funded by the European Union, we've identified that around 7,700 shillings is about half of what a household of four needs to support themselves for a month. And
But
that's,
doesn't Inuajami provide like 2,000?
yes.
Okay.
So there's a range of different programs, some by the World Food Program, some by us, that are giving different levels of help. And what we're trying to do moving forward is to bring these together more and figure out ways to expand social protection so that more people are protected.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if currently, is it that currently a family is only getting 2,000, or is that 2,000 from that program?
Yeah.
And then they're, pulling on, other little amounts from other, programs to then hopefully get them to at least 7,000 and above.
Right.
And if that's the case, then how do you sort of distinguish and ensure that there's no sort of double dipping, if you will, and
Right.
that everybody sort of at least gets a piece of the pie?
Absolutely. So we went in and we're working with the government as our other actors who are doing these safety nets programs. And we've gone and identified people who are already receiving Inuajami grants. So those people are receiving 2,000 shillings already. And what we're doing with them is we're topping them up. So we're sending them an additional 5,000 and something shillings to meet that that standard that we've set.
Okay.
And yeah, so yeah, that's how it works.
Okay, okay. Let's talk about gender and where that fits into social protection. I think, as we've seen in this season, we've seen an increase in cases of domestic violence, even as far as children are concerned, incest and child abuse, sexual abuse. What is the role of social protection, rather, as far as that's concerned?
Well, I hope that what feminism has taught us all is that men and women experience life differently, and that's because of our and the last thing I want to do is mansplain on TV, but I'm talking to the men in the audience. But yeah, we've learned that because of our cultural norms, because of the traditions that we have, men and women experience things differently, and so for every crisis, we need to pay special attention to how it affects women specifically. And so what we found with the COVID-19 crisis is, as you've pointed out, that yes, there have been rises of sexual and gender-based violence, which disproportionately affect women. Women are also overrepresented in informal settlements. So in general, that's a greater effect on women. And also you find that the chores that we take for granted every day, the cleaning of the house, the taking care of kids, the fetching water, which if you're in an informal settlement, that involves walking for a great distance and risking catching COVID-19. A vast majority of these are borne by women traditionally. And so we've seen an increase of this kind of care work, which is what we call it, in informal settlements. And that's being disproportionately borne by women who also have to take care of their kids, who are also the primary caregivers. They also have to go out and get a job. And so the combination of these factors makes the COVID-19 crisis an even more acute crisis for women, especially poor women in informal settlements.
Yeah. So what's the way forward as far as social protection in Kenya is concerned? Because it seems that we have a very, very long way to go. I mean, the majority of our population, are unemployed, young people, mostly living either in rural areas or in informal settlements in the urban areas. And as it is already, we're struggling to provide a sufficient amount based on the research that you've shared. So what to you is part of the way forward? What is it that is actually needed?
Well, I think the first thing is to have a clear understanding of what the risk is in the present. So we've done a range of studies in informal settlements. We've actually, we're part of this program called the Urban Early Warning Early Action System, which has been established in urban settlements with the government to rapidly identify what's happening in informal settlements in times of crisis. What we found is that because of these job losses that we're talking about, as many as from the people that we tested, people could only afford an average of half of the daily food and other needs that they required. Only a quarter of the households that we studied had a stable income earner. Like you're saying, people are jobless. And what this is also causing is malnourishment in children.
Yes.
Who, if they're under 5, could have long-term developmental effects, which then adversely affects their ability to combat poverty in the future. So we're seeing a crisis right now that could have long-term effects if we don't address it today. And in terms of moving forward, I think it's about combining our learnings. Like you're saying, there's a lot of different programs in the mix. We need to make sure we're not overlapping. We need to make sure we're speaking to each other, we're learning, and which is what we're trying to do. We're trying to support the government as much as we can and figure out how they can learn from us, how we can learn from them, and how we can support each other as a community to build social protection into the future.
Okay. And as far as social protection itself, so, there's a lot of debate as far as whether that's actually the best route to take anyways. A lot of people, at least a lot of economists, have a lot of questions about cash transfers and sort of the effectiveness of cash transfers. Has the science or the research, the policy environment changed at all over that? Or in your opinion, is that still really the option that we have today?
I think that people are coming on board with the idea more and more. I think that people are understanding that we need to take care of our fellow citizens, and the government's Inua Jamii program is, across East Africa, a flagship program that is being looked at as an example for what social protection could be in Africa. I think that a lot of the rumors that, a lot of the things that people say, the misunderstandings that people have about cash transfers are being steadily debunked, thankfully. We find that when people are given cash transfers, majority of studies have proven that they're likely to help people find dignified ways of surviving. In informal settlements, when you don't have money to put food on the table and you have to feed your children, a lot of people resort to negative coping mechanisms like prostitution, crime, things that are even more harmful to themselves.
Yeah.
We find that if you give them cash, they're not going to misuse it. They're actually going to spend it to feed their kids. They're going to spend it to improve their livelihoods. And an important part of social protection is asking the question of what's next. How can we move these people from that category of vulnerability and build their resilience so that they don't have to be vulnerable in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think then to those who are sort of seeking to work in this space, there's been a lot of different programs of people sort of donating, giving their time, cooking for people, providing all sorts of resources. Is there a way for them to also combine their efforts with yours, just so that we don't have this overlapping risk? Of course, Oxfam is a huge organization, but I'm referring to the ones who are doing this at a much smaller scale. Is there any sort of linkage there, or any way for them to sort of coordinate their efforts? Should they even be coordinating their efforts with, this larger consortium?
First, I think we need to consider social protection as a set of formal services and a set of informal services.
Okay.
Like I said earlier, when someone gets sick in your family, you're going to try and help if you can. So there's always going to be a set of informal mechanisms that are stepping into place to help. And it's important for those mechanisms, as we've seen in COVID-19, to also toe in line and respect what the government has recommended, which is for the benefit of all of us. Like, when we rush food into informal settlements, when we truck water in, we might end up causing more damage than we intend.
Okay.
So it's important that all of our efforts are aligned. And that's actually part of what the conference on Thursday is trying to do.
Yeah. Tell me about that. There's a conference on Thursday. Tell us a bit about what this conference is about.
Sure. So Thursday marks 8 months after the first case of COVID-19 was spotted in Kenya. And we are organizing a conference called Raising the Social Protection Floor. It's a conference that is bringing together all of these different social protection change agents, including the government, the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection, all of our consortium members of non-governmental organizations. We are bringing on our our friends from abroad who are funding some of these programs, like the European Union, who funds our consortium, the Danish government and the German government, and the UN. And we're all sitting around the same table, and we're discussing how we can improve on these programs through a series of 4 different panel sessions.
Okay. Is this open to people to sort of I don't know, I'm guessing it's not a physical event for the most part, but is it open for people to tune in at least?
Absolutely. So due to COVID-19, it can't be a physical event for everyone, but we are hoping that people tune in on live stream on our social media pages, Oxfam in KE on Twitter and Oxfam in Kenya on Facebook. And we will live stream the entire event, and we'll be taking questions from the audiences.
Okay. There's a question about expanding social protection to those who may not traditionally fall within the original bounds of social protection. And that's because, COVID obviously affecting every industry, but there are those, say, for example, who are in the creative industry, and they relied on what is known as the gig economy. Does social protection stretch its arms to cover, that group of people?
I would say absolutely. Anyone who is unable to support themselves in times of need should be protected. That's what it says in our Constitution, that anyone, despite their income, is entitled to health care, is entitled to food, is entitled to shelter and water. We're trying to make that a national reality, so it absolutely does include those people.
Okay. So it sounds like there'll be a lot to hear and a lot to learn at this conference on Thursday. And once again, just remind people how they can log on to it and be able to view, and the times once again.
Absolutely. So it's on Thursday, the 12th of November, from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. And we're live streaming from our Oxfam social media pages. On Twitter, that's Oxfam in KE, Oxfam in Kenya. And on Facebook, that's just Oxfam in Kenya, and you'll find us.
Great. Levi, thank you very much for coming on to the
Thank you
show.
so much.
Great